Titanic. 1,726 lives were lost on Titanic. I'm reading from Devil's Lake Weekly World, April 26, 1912. The accident happened on the evening of the 14th and 15th. It was in the wee hours of the 15th morning, 1912. I don't think that 1,726 lives is the correct number. The newspapers I found on Library of Congress were scattered. They had a range of numbers of dead. But I want to read you this article because it is fascinating. And starting in the far left column, we have a picture of Mrs. John Jacob Astor. He was a very wealthy man who died on the Titanic. I'll get to that story in a minute. Let's look at the first column. J. Price Ismay questioned. Special to the World, New York, April 19th, and the year, of course, 1912. J. Price Ismay, manager of the Marine Merchants in control of the White Star Line and the Titanic, who was on board the vessel, it is claimed was the first man passenger into the lifeboat. He was brought before the Senate today and questioned as to the disaster, explaining his escape from the sinking ship as others have, that there were no women in sight, and the officers ordered him to get into the lifeboat. Further investigation is being made of the disaster, and the Senate is putting Mr. Ismay to a severe test. Gee, don't you wish they put Larry Silverstein to a severe test to find out why he destroyed a 47-story skyscraper in Manhattan and who wired all the explosives in order to pull it? We'll talk about that later. I just wanted to get that jab in. Here's an article I never heard anything about regarding the Titanic. 4 killed who refused to give way for women. New York, April 20th. A thrilling story is told by Ellen Shine, a 20-year-old girl from County Cork, Ireland, who came here to visit her brother. Those who were able to get out of bed, said Miss Shine, rushed to the upper decks where they were met by members of the crew, who were endeavoring to keep them in the steerage quarters. You see, steerage passengers had the cheap seats, and so they wanted to make sure they died while they ushered first-class passengers into the lifeboats to save them. The steerage passengers don't count. They're disposable. The women, however, rushed by these men, knocking them down, and finally reached the upper decks. When informed that the lifeboat was sinking, most of them fell to their knees and began to pray. Jesus didn't save anybody on the Titanic. If your best hope was Jesus, you were in cold water in no time. She said, I saw one lifeboat and made for it. In it were 4 men from the steerage. They were ordered out by an officer and refused to leave. Then one of the officers jumped into the boat and, drawing a revolver, shot the 4 men dead. Their bodies were picked up from the bottom of the boat and thrown into the sea, unquote. That was a short article. 4 steerage passengers shot dead and their bodies hurled into the sea. That's what you get for not riding in first class. Next paragraph. Man coming to North Dakota lost his money. New York, April 20th, 1912. Charles Dahl, maybe he was an Austrian. Charles Dahl, D-A-H-L. Is that an Austrian name? Maybe it's an Austrian name. Charles Dahl, an Austrian, who took the Titanic from Southampton en route to his mother's home in North Dakota, lost in the sinking ship all the money he had in the world. Telling of the experience, he said, if he said it, he's still alive, quote, I was in bed when the crash came. Without stopping to dress, I rushed on deck, and in some way, I don't know how, I found myself in the water. I must have jumped. The height was terrible. Men were fighting women to get in the boats. I heard several shots fired around me. I was picked up by one of the boats. Do you believe it? If he jumped from the... I've been on a ship before, and if you jump, you're dead. that water is just like concrete. And so the first thing that makes me wonder is he says he doesn't know how he got in the lifeboat. And then the second thing is he says, I must have jumped. And he agrees that the height was terrible. If he hit that water, he would have been knocked unconscious. It's a 10-story building. You jump off that promenade deck and hit that water, you're moving. It'll knock you out. He says men were fighting women to get in the boats. How would he know? How would he know? I doubt very much that from the point where men are fighting women to get in the boat, now the boat is in the water. He says he was picked up. That means the boat is in the water, right? The boat is in the water. They see him. They pick him up. Baloney. He would have died in seconds from that cold water. I don't think he could last a minute in water that's 32 degrees. Put your foot in water that's 32 degrees. I was on Lake Michigan, Oak Street Beach. The water was 55 degrees. It was July. I put my toe in, and it hurt. 55 degrees is very painful. 32 degrees will make you unconscious in no time. And there are people in Chicago who dive into the water in the winter. The water is relatively warm. The air could be 30 degrees and the water is still 55. But these people dive into 55-degree water. They swim around a bit and come out. They're called polar bears, these people. And every year there was a big ceremony. Every winter they would jump into the cold water. But 32 degrees is a different story. Jumping from the 10-story building, that's the height of the Titanic. 10 stories down. I don't believe this story. I think that he sneaked into the lifeboat and he covered his face so they wouldn't know he was a man. But he lost all his money. So he comes to North Dakota with no money. How many people go back and read the newspaper accounts of what happened? We are completely without any exposure to this information, and I think it's fascinating. I recognize a city here, Fond du Lac, Wisconsin. Bert Moran tells of Fond du Lac doctor who perished in Titanic disaster. Among those who were on the ill-fated ship Titanic was Dr. Millihem of Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, and his name appears among the list of those who are missing. Dr. Millihem was a personal friend of Bert Moran of this city. It is said that a number of years ago, a fortune teller told the physician that he would lose his life on an ocean voyage, and the future forewarner went so far as to say that it would be the second voyage he took. Wow. I wonder if that story is true. I wonder who the fortune teller was and what other predictions were made. And who is recounting this episode, this tale? Are they looking for the limelight? I'm curious about that article because what I have learned in reading stories about the Wild West is that the newspapers are a bunch of liars. They make up anything in order to sell newspapers. So Dr. Millihem from Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, was told by a fortune teller, maybe, that he would die on an ocean liner and it would be the second voyage he took. We don't have any testimony here that it was the second voyage that he took. But the next paragraph says, when he left last fall for Europe, his friends brought this back to memory and asked him if he remembered it. He told them that he did, but did not think much of the incident, but before he left, made a final reckoning with his property and arranged every minor detail of his business. Now, did he pay to see this fortune teller? Was he married? It doesn't say anything here about a wife. Before he left, he made a final reckoning of his property and arranged every minor detail of his business. That the words of the fortune teller should not have proven true seems hardly believable, but such was the case, and it makes a strange coincidence in the history of this terrible disaster. I'm skipping that little one about Minnow Commercial Club, and I'm going to Mr. Guggenheim. You know who designed the Guggenheim? George Costanza. Just kidding. has a picture of Mr. Guggenheim, and the caption below the picture says, "One of the victims of the Titanic wreck, he is a member of one of the wealthiest families of the country." Let's go to the second column, Mrs. John Jacob Astor, and it has a photo. She's got some wrinkles, but that's the newspaper, not her. Photo by American Press Association. Statement by passengers. The following statement issued by a committee of the surviving passengers was given to the press on the arrival of the Carpathia. The Carpathia was the rescue ship. It was supposed to be the California, but it was too far away for some reason. And that was a big surprise to the crew because they expected to be rescued. Of course, steerage passengers had no idea, and they were fighting for their lives, and 4 of them got shot dead and thrown into the cold water like riffraff. We, the undersigned surviving passengers from the steamship Titanic, in order to forestall any exaggerated statements, deem it our duty to give to the press a statement of facts which have come to our knowledge and which we believe to be true. On Sunday, April 14th, 1912, at about 11:40 p.m., on a cold, starlit night, in a smooth sea and with no moon, the ship struck an iceberg, which had been reported to the bridge by lookouts, but not early enough to avoid a collision. There are so many questions about this accident. And like in 9/11, building number 7 is the smoking gun, which proves it was an inside job. On the Titanic, there were 50 cancellations at the last minute, and J.P. Morgan was one of them. He claimed he was sick, and instead he was in France. It was not Paris, it was, I think, northern France at a resort. I can't remember the French name, something about Pomme de Terre de Bain, or it means baths. It was a resort. And he's there with his mistress in good health. So why did he cancel? That is building number 7 of the World Trade Center. That is the smoking gun. 50 cancellations at the last minute. They knew the ship was going down. Here's another one, another smoking gun. The crew would not get on that ship. They knew it was going to be sunk. That ship that sank was not the Titanic. It was the damaged Olympic. It could not be repaired. And there is a big debate going on, and they're trying to prove one way or the other, but the smoking gun is that J.P. Morgan and 50 others canceled at the last minute. Why? He lied. He said he was ill, and he's there with his mistress in Pomme de Terre Bain, or whatever it was called. So the lookouts noticed that there's an iceberg, and they didn't have enough time to react. What is the purpose of a lookout? He looks out far enough to give notice in time. Are you saying that he screwed up? He fell asleep on the job? You're in the North Atlantic. There are icebergs. The ship struck an iceberg which had been reported to the bridge by lookouts, but not early enough to avoid a collision. As I recall, the ship was moving very fast, much faster than it should have been. The California was supposed to be there. What was the cargo on the California? You won't believe it. Heavy blankets and sweaters. Now, why would they need those? Because they were supposed to arrive and save the crew. And that's the boat that didn't get there in time, and the crew died. Steps were taken to ascertain the damage and save the passengers and ship. Orders were given to put on life belts, and the boats were lowered. The ship sank at about 2:20 a.m. With no moon, I wonder if anybody could have photographed it going down. They would have to have powerful spotlights. This is 1912. What kind of spotlights did they have? I don't know. The ship sank at 2:20 a.m. Monday. Now remember, it strikes the iceberg about 11:45, and it sinks at 2:20. So that's 2 hours plus 20 minutes plus 15 minutes. 2 hours and 35 minutes total. That's how long from striking the iceberg to sinking. The usual distress signals were sent out by wireless and rockets at intervals from the ship. Okay, so they have rockets that might provide a little bit of light. Did the California see those rockets from where they were? Were they below the horizon and unable to see the ship, but rockets go up much higher and indicate that there's danger? Wouldn't the California rush over there with their sweaters and blankets cargo to help out? Fortunately, the wireless message was received by the Cunard's Carpathia at about midnight, and she arrived on the scene of the disaster about 4 a.m. Monday. 2 hours after the ship sank, nobody in the water is alive. The man who said he must have jumped is a liar. He snuck into that lifeboat and covered his face so they wouldn't know he was a man. The officers and the crew of the steamship Carpathia had been preparing all night for the rescue and comfort of the survivors, and the last mention were received on board with the most touching care and kindness, every attention being given irrespective of class. Bullshit. Bullshit. This is what newspapers write to make you feel good. It's bullshit. 4 men were shot dead and their bodies thrown into the cold water. They were steerage passengers. The passengers, officers, and crew gave up gladly their staterooms, clothing, and comforts for our benefit. All honor to them. The English Board of Trade Passengers certificate on board the Titanic showed approximately 3,500. The same certificate called for a lifeboat accommodation of about 950 in 15 large lifeboats, 2 smaller boats, and 4 collapsible boats. The approximate number of passengers carried at the time of the collision was first class 330, second class 320, third class 750, total 1,400, officers and crew 940, total 2,340. Okay, so the Titanic is carrying 2,340 people and 1,700 of them perished. According to this article, of the foregoing about the following were rescued by the steamship Carpathia, first class 210. Remember, there were 330. So they saved more than half of them. Second class, they saved 125 out of 320. Third class, there were 750, 200 were saved. A little bit more than a quarter of them. They saved 4 officers, 39 seamen, 96 stewards, 71 firemen, total 210 of the crew. And the crew was 940, so most of the crew died. The total above, 775 saved, was about 80% of the maximum capacity of the lifeboats. I believe that when they decided to sink this damaged ship, it was a huge insurance swindle. In today's dollars, something like $120 million. And I think that they told the crew that they would be saved, and then they betrayed them because they didn't want them talking. And the best way to keep someone from talking is to kill them. So was there an honest mistake made with the California? I don't know. But the California wasn't there to save them. There's another fact that should be pointed out, that when the California left, there was a coal strike. And they mysteriously wound up with coal. Nobody could get coal, but the California got coal, and it rushed out to the place where the Titanic or Olympic would be sunk, and for some reason, the rendezvous point was a little bit off. And the California, with all its sweaters and blankets, did not save anybody, as far as I know. Now this statement continues, we feel it our duty to call the attention to the public to what we consider the inadequate supply of life-saving appliances provided for on modern passenger steamships, and recommended that immediate steps be taken to compel passenger steamships to carry sufficient boats to accommodate the maximum number of people carried on board. So what he's saying is the limiting factor here on what saved the lives was the lifeboats. They were at 80% of capacity. And the statement says, we ask that all passenger steamships have enough lifeboats to carry the entire crew and passenger list. The following facts were observed and should be considered in this connection. The insufficiency of lifeboats, rafts, etc., lack of trained seamen to man the same, stokers, stewards, etc., not efficient boat handlers, not enough officers to carry out emergency orders on the bridge, and superintend the launching and control of lifeboats absent of searchlights. The Board of Trade rules allow for entirely too many people in each boat to permit the same to be properly handled. On the Titanic, the boat deck was about 75 feet above water, and subsequently passengers were required to embark before lowering the boats, thus endangering the operation and preventing the taking on of a maximum the number of boats would hold. The boats at all times to be properly equipped with provisions, water, lamps, compasses, lights, etc. Life-saving boat drills should be more frequent and thoroughly carried out, and officers should be armed at boat drills. A great reduction in speed in fog and ice, as damage if collision actually occurs is liable to be less. In conclusion, we suggest that an international conference be called to recommend the passage of identical laws providing for the safety of all at sea, and we urge the United States government to take the initiative as soon as possible. Signed by Samuel Goldenberg, chairman of a committee. Now I will read the headline. The arrival of Carpathia brings news of death toll. Water-flooded boiler rooms. Captain Edward John Smith gave last instructions, women first, and then committed suicide by jumping from the bridge. Whole world mourns the disaster. After speed record. New York, New York, April 19th. It was determined today that the Titanic was going at the rate of 21 to 23 knots an hour, and was ordered to keep up that speed, the speed limit being 33 knots an hour. This was done according to the officers in order that the Titanic might make a speed record of its maiden trip. Okay, so the excuse was they were trying to set a record. So they're racing through iceberg-filled waters in the North Atlantic in order to set a record. How convenient. And they just happened to be riding a ship called the Olympic, whose name was changed and many modifications made in order to make it look identical to its sister ship. There were actually 3 of them. The Britannica was the 3rd one. But there were differences that could be noticed between the 2 ships, Titanic and Olympic, and changes were made to make them look identical. The fact that the crew would not get on board, all of them, they knew what was coming. The fact that J.P. Morgan and 50 of the first-class passengers all canceled a chance to ride on the maiden voyage, and they all canceled. Where there's smoke, there's fire. There's a lot of smoke there. Next section, knew of danger. That the Titanic knew of the danger ahead was evident from the fact that a message coming from the America, spelled with a K, describing the iceberg was relayed to Liverpool by the Titanic. The vessel was posted as to the existence of the ice field, but the officers ordered, "Go ahead and break all records, regardless of anything." Now that to me sounds like sabotage. Who ordered the crew to race through the waters when the America described the iceberg and that this message was relayed to Liverpool by the Titanic? So they knew of the danger. I think the captain had orders to crash it into an iceberg. There was a promise that the California would rescue them all, and then the captain would receive a big reward. When the rescue ship didn't arrive, he committed suicide. The next section says, special to the world, New York, New York, April 19th, the arrival of the Carpathia with its rescued passengers from the Titanic disaster, which made dock here at 9 o'clock last night. Now, this is the 19th. The accident happened on the 15th. It was 11:45 on the 14th. At 2:20 a.m. on the 15th, it sank. And on April 19th, there's a news article. The Carpathia arrived at 9 o'clock last night. That would have been the 18th. and brought the first actual news of the death toll of the ill-fated ship, and after careful check, it is given out with considerable degree of certainty that 1,726 lost their lives, numbered among the passengers and crew. The figures disagree all over the place. 2,208 aboard the Titanic. We were just given different figures. 2,300 and something. According to the reports of the White Star Line, there were 2,208 passengers and crew aboard the Titanic at the time of the disaster, bringing the number of those saved and on board the Carpathia, which arrived last night, down to 482. Although it has previously been reported that 868 were rescued from the ill-fated ship. So you see, there are numbers all over the place, and none of them are correct. They're all wrong. Water poured in. The actual cause which brought on the clamor for safety after striking the iceberg was due to water pouring into the boiler room, stopping the engines. Every effort was made to check the disaster, and the crew worked diligently, sticking to their posts and going down with the ship. All the crew, with the exception of those caring for the lifeboats, lost their lives. Captain Smith suicided. Given his last instructions, women first, Captain Smith, who stood on the bridge of the Titanic, committed suicide. He saw there was no hope for all to be saved. The suffering was too much for him to bear. Finding it impossible to save the lives of those who were going down with the sinking ship. Others are said to have followed the example of the captain, but most of the passengers went down and are now pinned in the deep underwater wreckage of steel. Remember, they would not allow steerage passengers to come out of their cabins. 745 on Carpathia. When the Carpathia arrived last night, it had 745 passengers on board, and they were all that seemed to have been saved. The later reports of passengers and crew showing 2,340 on board the Titanic. 2 efforts to shoot. Captain Edward John Smith of the Titanic made 2 efforts to shoot before the Titanic sank. One time in the cabin when officers prevented, he then rushed to the bridge where he fired 2 shots at which could be heard by the survivors after the lifeboats pulled away. I don't understand. Captain Edward John Smith of the Titanic made 2 efforts to shoot before the Titanic sank. Who is he shooting at? One time in the cabin when the officers prevented. Was he going to shoot himself? He then rushed to the bridge where he fired 2 shots which could be heard by the survivors after the lifeboats pulled away. I don't understand. Why is he shooting? Who is he shooting at? He fired 2 shots which could be heard by the survivors after the lifeboats pulled away. Did he shoot himself before he went to the water? Next heading was 1/4 mile. The Titanic was just 1/4 mile from the iceberg before the night lookout noticed it. And at about 12 o'clock midnight, the ship crashed into it, punching a hole in the side of the vessel. Passengers on deck. The passengers, who were all asleep, felt the jar, but none realized the calamity until they were ordered on the deck by the officers. The Titanic started sinking immediately, and at that hour the lifeboats were lowered. Women first. The order was, men, stand back, let the women pass. The women were lowered into the lifeboats, but all the women were not saved, many of them failing to get on deck when the lifeboats were lowered. If they were steerage passengers, they weren't allowed. Passengers version. Oh, this should be good. Just as soon as we arrived on deck, one man stated the lifeboats were manned by women. An officer called to me and said, "Are there any women on your deck?" I answered, "No." He told me to jump, which I did, landing in the lifeboat, every passenger of which was a woman. I doubt it. I doubt it. They let one guy be saved? I doubt it. That guy jumped into the lifeboat because they weren't going to allow him in. Give me a break. Next heading, clear night. 25 passengers on the Carpathia signed a sworn statement that the disaster was not due to any cloudiness, that it was a clear, bright night, starlight, and a smooth sea, which now suggests that it was a sabotage ship. That's why the crew wouldn't get on, and that's why J.P. Morgan and 50 first-class passengers got ill at the last moment. Life preservers. The Titanic had plenty of life preservers for all on board, and most all the passengers secured this thread of possible life, but the pressure was so great that all went down with the vessel. I don't understand. The pressure was so great. I think that when the ship went down, the water coming in took the passengers down with it. They were in the water and it sucked them down. It says, but the pressure was so great that all went down with the vessel. Well, I'll tell you, there are a lot of ways to die, and cold water is pretty darn quick, especially if you get pulled down with the vessel. Okay, that's enough for one day. I'm not going to try to read the entire paper. I just wanted to give you an idea of what the newspapers reported when the Titanic sank. It's a sad story, but like all stories, there's a lot more if you read between the lines. This was an insurance fraud. That Olympic was damaged and could not be insured. And it's very suspicious that 50 first-class passengers all decided to cancel, and J.P. Morgan said he was ill, and then he shows up in France in a resort with his mistress. What do you think happened? It's not so much what I think happened. I can raise a little bit of suspicion, but you have to ferret out the truth on your own. I have done a lot of reading about this, and it's confusing. Because when people plan such an insurance fraud, I think that people at Lloyd's of London were paid off, or whoever the insurer was. I don't remember. I think it was Lloyd's of London. Remember that people that work for the insurance company are in charge of other people's money, and they're paid a salary. And some guy comes along and wants a huge payoff from a sunk ship, and he works out his deals with the insurers in advance. He already knows all of them because he's always buying insurance from them. And since they're in charge of other people's money, it's pretty easy for them to wink, nod, accept an envelope full of money, and accept the claim for a huge amount of money. I think it was something like 12 million or 7 million or something like that, but in today's money it was something like 120 million US dollars. That concludes this video. Thanks for watching.